welcome to FOBtv, the future of business. I'm your host, Kevin Benedict. I'm a futurist and partner here at TCS, and I want to thank each of you for joining us today. My guest, I'm so excited to announce, is back again, David Espindola. David, thanks for joining us.
Hi, Kevin. Always a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you for having me here on the show again.
David is an author, and we'll talk about his book, and he's actually going to write a second book here as well. We'll talk about that a little bit. He is a technologist, a strategist, a futurist. He serves as the founding partner of Intercepting Horizons, where he prepares senior leaders to intercept strategic trends and converging technology vectors. That's a mouthful, David.
Wow, thank you for that great introduction. I appreciate it.
So let's just jump in today. You recently wrote a fascinating article. I think it was a week or two ago. It's called Tectonic Shifts, 10 Transformations that will profoundly impact humanity. You can find the link, matter of fact, for that article in the comments below. In it, you said assumptions in the way we conduct our business and personal lives today are about to be challenged. Every form of human organization, from government to corporation, is about to be questioned. Every economic model and means of production we have ever established is about to be unsettled. What motivated you to write something so profound in that article?
Yeah, so, the idea behind the article is I wanted to create an overarching thesis for things that I think are important as we look into the future. But before I answer your question specifically, I think it's important to note that nobody knows what the future holds, right? So all of these things that I'm talking about and the things that I wrote in the article are possible scenarios. And, they are based on trends and observations that we're seeing. These are some of the early signals. But just like any other future scenario, they're all subject to accelerants and inhibitors that will determine, their impact, the speed with which they may or may not occur. And we're seeing one developing right now as we speak, right? That might be an inhibitor to things in the future. So, back to your question. So I believe, we're living in the most extraordinary times in human history. We've never experienced change with the magnitude and velocity that we're experiencing today. And it's all driven by exponential technologies that are growing spectacularly, and they are converging to create these combinatorial powers that are really remarkable. So, in the book, I talk about some of these technologies. I talk about some mega trends that we're seeing. One of them is what we call upgraded transportation. And one segment of that is transportation as a service. So for those of you that don't know what transportation as a service is, it's basically a fleet of autonomous electric vehicles that will be able to hail from an app, just like we do with Uber, but we're talking about autonomous vehicles here. And this is something that's already operational. It's being implemented in Phoenix, Las Vegas, and some other cities. It could bring some significant changes to the automobile industry, to the insurance industry, and so on. It promises to bring many benefits. So one of the key benefits is potentially a reduction in transportation cost, which could be as much as 10 times. So today it costs about 70 to 80 cents per mile to drive a car. And the estimates are there will be able to reduce that to maybe 25 cents per mile, or some estimates go as low as 7 to 8 cents per mile, which is quite significant, right? And then, there's the savings in parking lot space, for instance. In LA, it's estimated that the amount of space occupied by parking lots is the equivalent of a city like San Francisco. So you could put all of San Francisco into LA. And then there are, benefits in terms of impact of car crashes. So it's estimated that about 1 million people every year die from car crashes. 50 million people get injured. And with transportation as a service, it's estimated that we'll be able to reduce those rates by 85 to 95%. Wow. So this is quite significant.
So you also write about, you say, according to Dr. Albert Bartlett, professor emeritus at the University of Colorado at Boulder, the greatest shortcoming of the human race is our inability to understand the exponential function. What do you see as the impact of that limitation on our future?
Yeah, so everything that we're talking about here, all the shifts that I mentioned in the article, they're all based on this foundation of technology-driven exponential change. The challenge is that exponential growth is quite difficult for us with our linear brains to visualize and to really comprehend, because exponential growth initially, it looks like nothing much is happening. It's very gradual initially, but then it hits an inflection point and it goes straight up. So some of these changes that we're seeing now, they're not at that point where it hits the inflection point. It's still in the stages of, gradual growth. But once we hit that inflection point, the changes will happen very quickly. And I think a lot of people will be surprised by some of those changes.
You also write, we are now entering a new phase in human history marked by a system of production that is based on creation rather than extraction. Why don't you explain that to us?
Some of these concepts are very well researched and documented by James Arbib and Tony Seba in their book, Rethinking Humanity. So I highly recommend anyone that's interested in learning more that they go to their book, which is available for free. But the idea here is that, historically, we have extracted everything that we consume, including food, materials, energy, and so on, from the earth and from human labor. And since these resources are limited, we've created a scarcity mindset and a model driven by economies of scale. But now we're starting to realize that we're reaching the limits of the system of production based on extraction. And this can be evidenced by quality and social unrest and environmental degradation and so on. So we desperately need a new system of production. And the good news here is that technology and science has advanced to the point now where we can start to foresee a migration towards this creation-based system of production. And in this new system, we'll be able to create large quantities of organic materials, for example, from the genetic information that can be found on a single cell. So, one example is with food, using precision fermentation, we will be able to create new sources of food based on DNA from an animal or a plant that will be able to create large amounts of protein.
That is fascinating. As a matter of fact, I did a report on that particular thing myself. And that is just crazy, where instead of having a dairy farm, you can generate the same kind of proteins inside giant tanks, like brewing beer and things like that. And without the methane and all kinds of the waste products and the degradation of the environment, as you pointed out.
Yeah, and it's not just the organic material. We can also do a much better job with creating new products and new materials using 3D printing, using nanotechnology, the materials that can be built from the molecular building blocks will be more flexible, will be stronger, will be cheaper. So there's a lot of potential with these technologies.
So kind of along that same line, you write about an emerging age of abundance. Now, when we look around, as you pointed out, many of us have that scarcity mindset.
Yeah.
We see a lot of inequality, we see injustices, we see poverty. Yet you're writing about a coming age of abundance. What's the difference there? How do those align?
First of all, I think it's very important to say that I don't think abundance is going to solve all of humanity's problems. I think human nature is not going to change. And we can just look at the United States as an example, and I know this doesn't apply to everybody, but in general, compared to most other nations in the world, we already live in partial abundance, right? We have people that, most people in the US have access to life's basic necessities. And yet, we have many, many problems, as you know. Abundance doesn't solve all the problems, but I think what it can do is it can have a significant impact in social economic areas. And the ones that I think are very, very important is how we deal with work, how we deal with time, and value. So these things can be transformed as we enter this new system of production that will allow for abundance.
Another trend that kind of comes with that you write about is moving from a centralized way of organizing to decentralized because of all these trends. Talk to us about how that fits in there.
We see that in several fronts, social, political, economical. So some examples of that are, the gig economy. We also see decentralization even within centralized organizations like businesses that are creating ecosystems of partners. And we're seeing several platforms flourishing also drive decentralization. We see things like ballot initiatives, we see open source, we see cryptocurrencies. All of these things are the early signals of this movement towards decentralization. And I think the ones that are really interesting right now are the ones that are driven by blockchain technologies. I mentioned cryptocurrencies, and the one that's best known is Bitcoin. So, Bitcoin, what's interesting about it is that it has a limited supply of 21 million Bitcoin. So within the protocol itself, you can't create more than 21 million Bitcoins. And that has several advantages. One is, you can't debase that currency, and it can't be manipulated by governments or by other entities because it's decentralized. And what's interesting about this is that, since the 2008 financial crisis, the Fed has been printing a ton of money, trillions and trillions of dollars, and which naturally, causes inflation, and it elevates the price of assets. So, this whole movement towards cryptocurrencies is, you can think of it as, the immune system sort of reacting to that process where, there's all this inflation coming with all this money printing. And this is a way for, the system to try to stop that from going forward. Whether it's going to be successful or not, nobody knows. But I think it's interesting from that standpoint. And then there are several other, movements that are supported by blockchain. You have, decentralized finance. You have decentralized autonomous organizations. We're still in the very early stages of all these things, and there are, several critics of the technology as it is today, which is expected, right? So if you remember, going back to the early 90s. When the internet was starting to flourish, people were very reluctant to buy things with their credit card on the internet, and we've overcome those challenges. So I think we're sort of at the same stage right now with some of these decentralized constructs that are supported by blockchain.
That's so fascinating that technology can enable things within society, within all kinds of different areas outside of just an economic issue or a technology issue. They can impact all the different dimensions and domains of humans. You write, soulless machines will focus on the mundane, the things that don't really matter, so that we humans can become free, rise above, and focus on what truly matters, the higher purposes sought by our souls. That's so poetic and powerful. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack here. So let's see if we can walk through it. So, it starts with this idea that exponential technologies are driving this creation-based production system. And if that leads to abundance, then, combined with the fact that we have AI and robots and automation, that is likely to do most of the work that humans do today. Not all of it, but I think a lot of it will be replaced by AI and by robots, whether they do it on their own or whether they have a human working collaboration with the machines. The efficiencies that these automation systems will bring will create a lot of what's called technical unemployment. So the good news is there's potential for abundance. The bad news is we're going to have unemployment driven by these new technical capabilities, just because of the fact that, the machines will become more capable than we are. And the machines can work nonstop 24/7, right? So what we'll see is that anything that can be automated will become commoditized. And that list of things that can become automated is growing every day, right? So we keep hearing new reports coming out. There was just a recent one that came out that talked about how AI will be able to, it's catching up very quickly to human ability to write code. And I think we'll see, AI encroach on several professions, including, journalists. AI can write full articles and sentences and books, doctors, lawyers. So all of us will be impacted by these capabilities. So I think that the natural migration from a human activity standpoint will be for us to focus on expressive works. So these are the types of activities that require human originality, requires creativity. It's the things that we do where we express our emotions. And I think these things will become increasingly more valuable when compared to things that can be produced by machines. So it's no different than, what we see, for instance, with craftsmen, people that build things by hand, and those crafts are more valuable than what you can order from a factory. So it's sort of the same concept there. I think we're starting to see the early signals of how that's starting to happen. So the things that we're seeing now is how people are using their original content creativity to create blogs and podcasts and educational videos. And, several people are actually making a living doing those types of things. So I think those are some potential early signals. And then the other thing that we see is, how the people that are really good at this are the highest paid people on the planet, right? It's the entertainers. It's the people that have domain control over this attention economy. So I think those things will increasingly become more valuable, and humans will naturally migrate towards, these expressive type of works.
Wow, that's so fascinating. Scary, I must say, but also fascinating. So we are in a transitory period filled with turbulence, instability, and transition, which is the scary part of what we're just talking about here. But when we get to the other side, we will find abundance and purpose. We must find the pathway to cross this chasm. Tell us about this pathway. What do you see? What do you think the journey is going to look like as we move through this process and all these changes are maturing, they're actually happening, and they hit us all? Walk us through what you think that journey will be like.
Yeah, so I like to think of it as a great change management challenge that we're facing right now. So, we're going through some very deep, fast changes that are difficult for us to absorb. If you study the change management literature, and I spent most of my career introducing change, what I've learned is that in order for you to be successful with change, the very first thing that you need to do is you need a very well articulated vision that you can share with your target audience. Naturally, I think you will find within that population of people, the champions. They're going to be inspired by that vision, that will step up and lead, and that will bring other people along. Now, by the same token, you're also going to find detractors, right? People that are going to either try to slow or stop the change altogether. And then you're going to have skepticals, people that are sort of in a wait and see kind of mode. As we go through this transition period, it's very important that we find leadership that can articulate that vision. We need to, the one thing that I see now is that there's so much negativity everywhere, right? And that negativity is creating division. And a lot of it is driven by fear, I believe. So we need to have a new breed of leaders that can paint a picture of a prosperous future and that can articulate a credible plan on how we're going to get there. So I'm hoping that the new generation, which is much more in tune with technology, I think they're much more likely to understand exponential growth. They're much more conscientious about some of the decisions that we've made in the past that have resulted in unanticipated consequences. So I'm hoping that new generation will provide the seeds of the leadership that we need going forward.
Thank you for that direction, because that's going to be so critical. It seems like the more I write about the future as a futurist here at TCS, the more it seems like we have to be so purposeful. We can't just let things happen to us, because it's like being on a boat with no rudder. You really need to have a direction and navigate to that direction. And on that note, you mentioned before James Arbib and Tony Seba from Rethinking Humanity, and they have a quote here: "For the first time in history, we have not just the technological tools to make an incredible leap in societal capabilities, but we have the understanding and foresight to see what's coming." If we go along with that and say, for the first time in history, not only do we have the tools to make a better future, but we can see far enough ahead now where we can do something about it and be purposeful for that. And because if you don't do things on purpose, how do you avert disasters from people that are negative and frightened of the future?
Yeah. So, I think it goes back to, we need to create a plan. We need to articulate a vision. And, I think it's really important that people understand that there is a potential bright future ahead, right? Instead of just all the negative things that we hear about every single day. And I think that requires education. I think we need to really help people understand how there's a path for us to get to that other side where we can be more purposeful and we can experience abundance and experience a bright future. So there's a way for us to get there. The problem is, I think most people are unaware of that. They don't understand exponential growth and the technologies that are driving this exponential growth. So all they see is scarcity, inequality, environmental degradation, and that naturally creates a lot of fear, right? And the fear drives division. So, this is not good. So I think to change that, starts with the vision. Then we need to educate people so they can understand that there is a potential bright future ahead. And I'm hoping that the work that you and I do every day is making a little tiny dent in that direction, so people can start to understand what's possible in the future. Obviously, we also need to be realistic, right? So there are going to be some challenges in the near future because change is never easy. There's always turbulence during that changing period. And it's likely that in the next decade or so, we're going to experience, several shocks to the system, whether it's, pandemics or wars or other things that may come along. To make progress, we really need to think differently. We need to recognize the complexity, the magnitude, the velocity of all these changes that are coming. And we need to adopt a systems thinking approach to solving, the problems that we're trying to solve for, and let go of the temptation to come up with, point solutions with unintended consequences. The challenge is, you need to continue investing in the future, but at the same time, since this is going to be a turbulent period, you need to figure out how you maintain, stability. How do you maintain social, economic, and political stability so that you don't get to the point where the whole system collapses, right? So we can't let the system collapse altogether. But at the same time, we can't continue printing money indefinitely without thinking about the consequences. Yeah. So it's striking that balance that I think is essential.
David, thank you twice for joining us today. And I say that because I didn't record the first version of this. I forgot to record it, and I had to beg him to stay with us and let us record it a second time.
It was good practice the first time around, so that was a good idea, actually.
Oh boy, that's so embarrassing. But anyway, thank you twice, David, for joining and sharing your expertise with all of us today.
Always a pleasure talking with you, Kevin. I enjoy being here. I think these are important things that we need to be talking about. So thank you for the opportunity to share my thoughts with your audience.
Thank you. And look for David Espindola's new book coming out sometime in the future.
It's still in the very early stages of planning, but when I'm ready to announce a little bit more detail, I'll be happy to do that.
Yeah, and we'll have you back and we can talk about it then. Thanks, David.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you, Kevin.